You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following: and by viewers like you.
There was an explosion last month in Israel, not of rockets or bombs, but one that many in the Jewish community believe could ultimately have equally devastating effects on the future of the Jewish state. The explosion was in response to a vote taken on July 11th in the Israeli Knesset's Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, in which the controversial Rotem Conversion Bill passed by a vote of 5-4. The anger this committee vote engendered in the non-Orthodox Jewish community of America is as vociferous and as ferocious as I can ever remember. It was fueled by email campaigns from non-Orthodox institutions in America and was further ignited by an inflammatory New York Times op-ed piece written by Alana Newhouse, editor-in-chief of the online Tablet magazine, which actually suggested that the bill, if passed into law, would subject Israelis to Jewish identity checks, and that it threatens to sever the vital connection between Israel and the American Jewish diaspora. And I have never received so many emails from you, Shalom TV viewers, asking if we're going to address an issue. And many of my own congregants sent me emails of concern and outrage. Now, I want, before anything else, for the sake of editorial honesty and journalistic integrity, to make my own personal position absolutely clear. And if you've watched Shalom TV for any length of time, or if you know me, or feel you know me, what I'm about to say will be no surprise to you. If I could have my way, if the State of Israel asked me for advice or direction, I would state unequivocally that Israel should be a pluralistic Jewish state, embracing non-Orthodox expressions of Judaism, just as it embraces Orthodoxy. In my opinion, non-Orthodox rabbis, conservative rabbis, and Reform rabbis, and Reconstructionist rabbis, as well as modern Orthodox rabbis who often have no standing in the State of Israel, all should be able to lead their respective congregations. They all should have the power to marry Jews in Israel. They should all have the power to convert a non-Jew to Judaism in Israel, just as it's done in America and virtually everywhere throughout the Jewish diaspora. And there should be a third section of the Western Wall, the main plaza of the Western Wall, where non-Orthodox men and women can stand together in prayer, and where non-Orthodox Jewish women could express themselves Jewishly as they wish. There's something ironic and unfortunate, and from my perspective, even something un-Jewish in the Jewish state of Israel, handing control of family law in matters of marriage, divorce, and burial solely over to the ultra-Orthodox establishment in Israel. That's my position. But having made my position clear, I find the response, the hysteria over the Rotem Conversion Bill to be wildly exaggerated, and that the attention is misplaced, primarily because most American Jews simply don't understand the current status quo in Israel when it comes to conversion, marriage, and to Israel's law of return. There is this sudden worry about Israel changing the notion of who is a Jew, even though that question is really not at issue in the Rotem Conversion Bill. And what we want to do here on Shalom TV is offer you some basic information and then present a number of conversations that might help put this entire issue into a more proper perspective for you. By the way, the bill, which passed out of committee again on July 11th, has now been tabled for the next 6 months. And personally, I am overwhelmingly confident that Israel will never, ever pass a bill that disenfranchises non-Orthodox diaspora Jewry. But if you care about this issue, let's take a look at what the Rotem Conversion Bill actually does propose. The bill was sponsored by a member of the Knesset, David Rotem, of Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party, a party which is intimately involved with and represents Russian immigrants to Israel from the former Soviet Union. Now, some 350,000 of these Russian immigrants are not considered Jewish by the State of Israel, even though they are Israeli citizens under the law of return, and even though many of them serve in the Israeli army, and they want to become Jewish. But there's a serious logjam which prevents large-scale conversions in Israel. So David Rotem introduced a bill with the express intent of making it easier for these Russian immigrants to convert to Judaism. How? By giving local city rabbis a new authority to perform conversions, something they're not permitted to do at the present time. Virtually no one in Israel, or really around the world, opposes this intent of the Rotem Conversion Bill, making it easier for Russian immigrants to convert to Judaism. The problem arises because the bill also would concretize in law that the ultra-Orthodox establishment in Israel, in the office of the chief rabbinate, would have ultimate authority over these local rabbis. And this is both offensive to non-Orthodox institutions in Israel and in the diaspora, and from the perspective of non-Orthodox institutions, such as conservative and Reform Judaism, it paves the way towards a slippery slope that might ultimately lead to a change in Israel's law of return, or at least opens a door for the chief rabbinate to try to change the law of return in the future. And in many respects, this issue is all about Israel's law of return and the question of who is a Jew. And if you know how the State of Israel operates, you know that in the 1950s, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, adopted a law of return that states that any Jew can apply for and receive immediate Israeli citizenship regardless of their religious practice or affiliation. And more important, if there are converts to Judaism, then regardless of who converted them, they are eligible for the law of return. In other words, Israel recognizes any conversion by any rabbi outside the State of Israel when it comes to the law of return and the Jew's right to become an Israeli citizen. In essence, Israel's law of return is the response to Hitler. If in Nazi Germany any Jew could have been thrown into the ovens, regardless of religious affiliation or religious practice, then any Jew can now become an Israeli citizen. And remember, this applies to any Jew by choice, even if their conversion was under non-Orthodox auspices. The law of return has nothing to do with halakha, because the State of Israel is simply the Jewish state for all Jews, whether they do or do not observe halakha. That's the law of return. But inside the State of Israel, things work very differently. Inside Israel, in matters of family law, the chief rabbinate is the recognized authority And Israel does follow Orthodox halacha, Orthodox law, in these matters. And so, a Jew who converts with a conservative or reform rabbi in America is welcomed as an Israeli citizen under the law of return. But if that same Jewish convert wishes, once that convert comes to Israel, to marry in Israel, that Jewish convert will be unable to do so, because the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel will not recognize his non-Orthodox conversion. And in Israel today, only Orthodox rabbis are empowered to preside at Jewish marriages. And that's one of the complaints of non-Orthodox rabbis in Israel. Currently, if an Israeli wants to be married by a non-Orthodox rabbi, that Israeli has one of two choices: have an official marriage at a town hall by an Orthodox rabbi, and then have a chuppah ceremony later in their hometown with any rabbi one wishes. That's one alternative. The other alternative? To travel outside of Israel, get married outside of Israel, and then return as a married couple. And yes, it is surely ironic that the only place in the world where Jews cannot be married by the rabbi of their choice is the state of Israel. But the reality is that the overwhelming number of Israelis have accepted the status quo, and they simply live with it. For Israelis, Jewish pluralism as we know it in America is still foreign to their ways of thinking. The predominant Israeli attitude is, I don't want to be Orthodox, but if I were to be an observant Jew, I would be Orthodox, because Orthodoxy is the only really legitimate expression of Judaism. That's the typical Israeli mentality. So bottom line, for purposes of Israeli citizenship, a conservative or reform or reconstructionist conversion is valid. But for purposes of marriage in Israel, that same non-Orthodox conversion is invalid. And by the way, in Israel, the only conversions possible are Orthodox conversions. That's Israeli law today. And the Rotem Conversion Bill changes nothing substantial in Israeli law. By the way, the Rotem Conversion Bill does not even mention the law of return at all. And if you wish to read it for yourself, we've put it up in English on the Shalom TV website, www.shalomtv.com. And this is what many American Jews have been worried about, that somehow the Rotem Conversion Bill will change the ability for conservative or reform or any non-Orthodox Jews to obtain Israeli citizenship under the law of return. This is simply not the case. The law of return is not in jeopardy at all. And those who have made an issue of it, such as Alana Newhouse in her op-ed piece in the New York Times, have seriously distorted the real issues and have misdirected the attention. By the way, for the record, when Ms. Newhouse claims there's a Talmudic passage in which the great sage Hillel converted a pagan on the spot and quotes Rabbi Joseph Telushkin as her authority, I'm sure Rabbi Telushkin knows well and would point out to her that first, of course it was a pagan. Whom else would seek conversion by Hillel at the time? Only pagans. And then, what Hillel actually did in the Talmudic text was to accept the pagan for conversion on the spot. Not that Hillel actually converted anybody on the spot, just accepted the pagan on the spot. And then for Ms. Newhouse to add a vicious ad hominem attack on the integrity of Orthodox rabbis in Israel by citing improper actions of a single Orthodox rabbi. It's the worst form of yellow journalism that smears Jewish reputations for no good reason. You know, there are bums everywhere, even among non-Orthodox rabbis. And for her to color the issue by attacking a specific Orthodox rabbi as if his behavior is somehow normative, that should have been a red flag to any thinking American who read her op-ed piece. So how much concern should there be over the Rotem Conversion Bill? Earlier this year, David Rotem, the author of the bill, visited the United States for the express purpose of explaining the intent of his bill and to allay the concerns of non-Orthodox Jewish leaders. Our own Alan Ulrich had a chance to sit with Knesset member Rotem to discuss the proposed conversion bill, and we'd like you to hear pieces of Alan's conversation with David Rotem. And I would ask you to pay special attention to what Mr. Rotem says he will do if he's unable to convince American Jewish leaders to support his conversion bill.
I have proposed a bill that is concerning the fact that city rabbis in Israel will be able to perform conversion. I think it's a very important bill because it's going to solve a problem of about 350,000 new immigrants who are Israeli by citizenship but not Jewish according to the halakha, and I would like them to be able to convert. I'm here because in the stages of enacting this bill, suddenly I found out that the American Jewish community, or part of it at least, is against the law. And I read letters and articles who are threatening Israel of losing the support of the American Jewry. Now, I'm not willing to accept it. And I'm not going to enact this law against the will of American Jewry. So I came here to meet the leaders of American Jewry to make sure that we can settle to a position where they will be in favor of this law. American Jews are my brothers and my sisters. I want to be in a position that whenever any one of us is in need, he knows that this is his family. And I'm not willing to break these ties. We are talking about technical problems and not in Jewish law. We are not going into the heart of religion. I don't want to go into the heart of religion. Therefore, I told non-Orthodox movements in America that their problem is going into the heart of relation between Jews. I don't want to go into this problem. I want to arrange a technical way to help people, and this is my job. But I am not willing to risk the relation between the State of Israel and the diaspora Jews on this issue. Yep. If I won't succeed, I will say, I'm sorry, I've tried my best, I am doing my best. Somebody else will have to bear the responsibility of this problem.
So there you heard David Rotem tell Alan Ulrich that he promised he would not introduce his bill into law if American Jewish leaders opposed his bill, or if it threatened in any way to cause a breach in the relationship between Israel and Diaspora Jewry. And many Jewish leaders in America and in Israel believe Minister Rotem did not keep his promise. And that's one of the reasons people are suspicious now of the real intent of the bill. And by the way, I should also mention to you, there are Orthodox rabbis in the United States, Orthodox rabbis, who've expressed their opposition to the Rotem Conversion Bill, even though they fully support and endorse halakha, Jewish law. But they oppose it because they realize that any perception that Israel is distancing itself from the Jewish world as a whole is antithetical to the very essence of the State of Israel as the home of the Jewish people, the home of Klal Yisrael. And if you have the chance, visit the website of the New York Board of Rabbis and see the statement of the board's president, Orthodox Rabbi Yaakov Kermeyer, rabbi of the prestigious Fifth Avenue Synagogue of New York. But if the Rotem Conversion Bill doesn't change the law of return, and if the chief rabbinate already has control of conversion in Israel, then what's the real issue? First, the real issue is about the potential for Jewish pluralism to flourish in Israel, which again, I believe would be good for the Jewish state. But by explicitly stating in Israeli law, that the chief rabbinate has control of conversions, it will make it more difficult for non-Orthodox conversions to be accepted in Israel. Not in America, remember. Non-Orthodox conversions are not affected by the Rotem Conversion Bill. Conservative and Reform conversions performed in America will still be valid under the law of return, even if the Rotem Conversion Bill passes. No American non-Orthodox Jew is being invalidated or alienated or disenfranchised by the Rotem Conversion Bill. What is true is that if there are Jews in Israel who want to appeal to the Israeli Supreme Court over a decision made by the chief rabbi under current Israeli law, since there is no legislative conversion bill, Israelis are free to appeal to the Supreme Court. And there are a couple of appeals right now before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has sort of ducked the issue and is not ruling on them. But if the Rotem Conversion Bill passes into law, then by statute, matters are no longer relevant to the Israeli Supreme Court, but must now be addressed in terms of law itself, and people will lose the ability to appeal to the Israeli Supreme Court on matters that they feel should be brought to the court in opposition to a decision of the chief rabbinate. And there are some who argue, a rather small point, that the Rotem Conversion Bill prevents a non-Jew from spending time in Israel, then returning to his native country, converting in his native country, and then returning and applying again for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. The Rotem Conversion Bill says you can't spend time in Israel, then return home, convert to Judaism, and then apply for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. But this feature of the Rotem Conversion Bill only applies, and this is very important that I've not heard anyone explain this, this feature of the bill only applies to individuals who've spent time in Israel illegally. This provision does not apply to a non-Jew who simply visits Israel on a tour or on a birthright trip. It's meant to deny citizenship to, for example, a Palestinian who somehow gains employment in Israel illegally, then is sent home, and then decides to convert to Judaism and apply under the law of return for Israeli citizenship. His illegal presence in Israel prevents his being able to apply for citizenship under the law of return at a later time. And by the way, the law of return already gives the Israeli government the right to deny citizenship to anyone it believes will be a threat or a detriment to the Jewish state. And Israel is having some problems with visiting workers, especially from the third world, who come to Israel, stay illegally, or sent home. And some of them want to come from African countries and make aliyah under the law of return. And yes, the Rotem Bill would make that impossible. And yes, if the Rotem Conversion Bill were to become law, it would be more difficult still for conservative and Reform rabbis to become officially accepted by Israeli law. And no conservative or Reform rabbi would be able to marry or convert someone inside the state of Israel. And for that, there is a real reason to oppose the bill, as Natan Sharansky, the head of the Jewish Agency, has done. And it's why I believe the state of Israel is very unlikely to pass this bill into law. Again, it's all about perspective and balance. The sky is not falling, and no one should suggest it is. Israel is not about to create a breach between the Jewish state and Diaspora Jewry. And if you care about Jewish pluralism in Israel, then you should be concerned. And you should lend your voice to those who are working for Jewish pluralism in Israel. You know, some 20 years ago, I had the chance to speak with a wonderful, then young Orthodox rabbi, Shlomo Riskin, who had recently become the chief rabbi of Efrat in Israel, had established wonderful new schools of Jewish learning. And I asked Orthodox Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, chief rabbi of Efrat, whether he would like to see Israel become a Torah state, a state based on halakha. And Shlomo Riskin gave me what I believe is the quintessential Jewish answer to this question. Here's what Shlomo Riskin had to say.
Mark, I would love nothing better than for Israel to be a Torah state. But only if and when the overwhelming majority of inhabitants of Israel would like it to be a Torah state. I believe that coercion and religion are mutually exclusive terms. I stand foursquare presently in favor of the separation of religion and state in Israel.
Even in Israel?
I think it would be the healthiest thing for Torah in Israel, the healthiest thing for religion in Israel. I don't believe that the mix of religion and politics makes sense at this particular juncture when the majority of people are not observant Jews, or certainly not Orthodox observant Jews.
Of course, Shlomo Riskin would like Israel to be a Torah state, but not until the overwhelming majority of Israelis want it to be a Torah state. How perfect an answer is that? The state of Israel is the state of world Jewry. And Jewish practice in Israel should reflect the will of the Israeli people. And in some way, I would like to see it reflect the practice of world Jewry. The vast majority of Israelis are not Orthodox, but they do seem comfortable with Orthodox styles of life. And I can understand someone arguing that until the majority of Israelis want Israel to be a Jewishly pluralistic state, it should not be. The Rotem Conversion Bill is not a real threat to who is a Jew under the law of return, but it does touch upon the question of the viability of Jewish pluralism in the Jewish state. Now, we have a number of interviews for you that further develop some of these themes. We have a very lively discussion between Rabbi Julie Schoenfeld, Executive Vice President of the Conservative Movement's Rabbinical Assembly, and Rabbi Schoenfeld has been one of the most active and vocal opponents of the Rotem Conversion Bill. And she sits with Rabbi Stephen Pruzansky, the Northeast Vice President of the Orthodox Movement's Rabbinical Council of America. And Rabbi Pruzansky argues that Israel should, in fact, only operate in all areas of life, including the law of return, according to halakha. You can also hear conversations with the two individuals who are in principal leadership roles, one in America and one in Israel, Jerry Silverman, President and CEO of the Jewish Federations of North America, and Natan Sharansky, Chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel. And again, many of you asked if we would be addressing the issue of the Rotem Conversion Bill, and I hope my giving you some background to this issue and the other pieces we have for you this week will be of help. Of course, I welcome any of your thoughts or comments or disagreements you may have with some of the things I've just said. Please be in touch with me by email or by mail this week. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.